The needle pierced flesh instead of fabric, and Martha Whitmore didn't even flinch. Blood welled from her fingertip, a dark bead that she wiped absently on her already stained apron before returning to her work. In the dim gaslight of her attic room, such injuries were as common as the rats that scratched behind the walls. Her fingers had long since lost most of their feeling, numbed by countless hours bent over fabric, by winter cold that seeped through every crack in the wooden walls, by the relentless monotony of survival in Whitechapel. It was November 1888, and the East End of London wore its poverty like a second skin. Outside Martha's window, the sounds of the street never ceased, drunken shouts, the clatter of horse-drawn carts over cobblestones, the occasional scream that might mean violence or merely someone's nightmare given voice. She had learned not to look, not to wonder. Curiosity was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when she had 3 more shirts to finish before dawn if she wanted to eat tomorrow. The shirts lay in a heap beside her, coarse cotton destined for shop boys and clerks, men who would never know the name of the woman who had sewn their clothes, who would never imagine the attic room where their garments took shape. Mr. Abramson, the middleman who brought her work, paid 4p per shirt. It took her nearly 3 hours to complete one, her fingers moving in practiced rhythm, stitch, pull, until the seams were straight and strong enough to pass his inspection. Martha held the current shirt up to the light, squinting to check her work. The flame in her single gas lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. She should turn it lower to save money, but then she wouldn't be able to see the stitches, and Mr. Abramson would reject the work. He had rejected her labor before, pointing out invisible flaws with his magnifying glass, declaring the stitching too loose, too crooked, too something. Those rejections meant hunger, meant choosing between bread and coal for the fire. She set the shirt aside and picked up the next, her mind drifting as her hands began their mechanical work. It was dangerous to think too much, she had learned. Thinking led to remembering, and remembering led to the deep well of grief that threatened to swallow her whole. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, memory came unbidden. 5 years ago, she had been Martha Fletcher, newlywed, full of cautious hope. Thomas had been a docker, strong and steady, with gentle eyes that crinkled when he smiled. They'd had a room in Bethnal Green, just one room, but it had been theirs. Thomas would come home smelling of the river and tobacco, his wages enough for them to eat meat twice a week, enough for Martha to imagine a future that included children, perhaps even a small house with a garden. The cholera had taken him in August, during one of those hot summers when disease ran through the East End like fire through dry grass. One day he had been laughing, planning how they would save for a better room. 3 days later, she was a widow, standing in the rain at a pauper's funeral, watching his coffin lowered into a common grave. Martha's needle paused, hovering over the fabric. She forced herself to breathe, to push the memory back down. Grief was another luxury she couldn't afford. After Thomas died, the landlord had wanted the room for a family who could pay more, and Martha had found herself adrift in a city that cared nothing for a lone woman's suffering. She'd moved from room to room, each cheaper and smaller than the last, until she'd ended up here, in this attic, in Flower and Dean Street, in the heart of Whitechapel's darkness. The needle resumed its work. Stitch, pull, stitch, pull. The rhythm was almost meditative, if one didn't think about what it represented, the slow grinding of a life into nothingness, hour by hour, day by day. Martha was 32 years old, though she looked older. Poverty aged a woman faster than time. A knock at the door startled her so badly that she dropped the shirt. No one knocked at her door, not at this hour. It was past midnight, the time when honest folk were asleep and dishonest folk were about their business. Her heart hammered as she stood, her legs stiff from hours of sitting. "Who's there?" Her voice came out thin, uncertain. "Mrs. Whitmore? It's Annie from downstairs. Please, I need help." Martha opened the door to find Annie Chapman, her neighbour from the second floor, holding a bundle of fabric. Annie's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from weeping or drink or both. She was older than Martha, perhaps 45, with the worn look of a woman who had survived too much. "What's wrong?" "It's my daughter Lily. She's sick, terrible sick." Burning with fever, Annie's voice cracked. "I need to work tonight. I've got to earn money for medicine, for food. But I can't leave her alone, and I've got this order that must be finished by morning." She held out the bundle. Would you be willing to take it? I'll split the payment with you, honest I will." Martha looked at the fabric. More shirts by the look of it. Her back ached, her fingers throbbed, and her eyes burned from the poor light. She had her own work to finish. Every logical part of her brain screamed that she couldn't afford to help, that charity was for the rich, that in Whitechapel you looked after yourself or you didn't survive. "Please," Annie whispered. "I know you've got your own work, but I'm desperate. Lily's all I have left in this world." Martha thought of Annie's daughter, a thin girl of about 12, with her mother's sad eyes. She thought of Thomas, of how quickly life could steal away everything you loved. She took the bundle. "Go to your daughter," she said. "I'll finish what I can." Annie's gratitude poured out in broken thanks and promises to repay the kindness, but Martha closed the door gently, cutting off the words. She didn't want thanks. Thanks didn't pay the rent or buy bread. She returned to her chair and examined Annie's work. 6 shirts partially completed, smaller than the ones she'd been working on. Children's shirts? They would fetch even less money than adult sizes, perhaps 3p each. She laid them out, calculating. If she worked through the night without stopping, she might finish her own 3 shirts and perhaps 2 or 3 of Annie's. That would leave Annie with less work to do tomorrow, might give her time to care for her daughter. It wouldn't be much, but it would be something. Martha picked up her needle again and returned to work. The gas lamp flickered. Outside, a woman's laugh echoed through the street, high and desperate. The night deepened around her, and her fingers moved through the darkness, weaving thread through fabric, binding together scraps of cotton into garments that would warm bodies she'd never see. She worked until her vision blurred, until the stitches seemed to swim before her eyes. Dawn crept through the window, grey and cold, finding her hunched over the last of her own shirts. She'd completed all 3 of hers and 2 of Annie's. The remaining 4 would have to wait. Her hands trembled as she set down the needle. She had been sewing for nearly 12 hours straight. She stretched, hearing her spine pop, feeling the deep ache in her shoulders. There was no time for rest. She needed to deliver her work to Mr. Abramson before he left for the day, needed to collect her payment before he drank it away or claimed she'd brought the work too late. Martha gathered her 3 finished shirts, wrapped them carefully in a cloth, and descended the narrow stairs. The building where she lived was one of the worst in Flower and Dean Street, which was saying something. The floors tilted, the walls were damp with mould, and the smell of human misery permeated every corner. On the second floor, she passed Annie's door and heard the sound of a child coughing, wet and harsh. She paused, then knocked softly. Annie opened the door a crack, her face showing the ravages of a sleepless night. "I finished 2 of the shirts," Martha said, handing them over. "The rest are started. You should be able to complete them this evening. You're an angel," Annie breathed. "A true angel." "How can I ever—" "Just take care of your girl," Martha interrupted. She couldn't bear the weight of gratitude, not when she'd done so little. "I'll be back later." She continued down to the street, stepping carefully around the refuse that littered the stairs. Outside, Whitechapel was waking to another day. The sky was the colour of dirty water, and a fine rain had begun to fall, turning the streets into rivers of mud and filth. Martha pulled her thin shawl tighter and began walking. Mr. Abramson's shop was in Commercial Street, a 20-minute walk from her room. She passed the doss houses where those even poorer than herself paid 4p for a night's sleep on a rope stretched across a room. Lean over the rope to rest, and when morning came, the rope would be cut, dumping the sleepers onto the floor. She passed the pubs already open, already full of men and women seeking oblivion in gin. She passed women standing in doorways, their faces painted, their eyes empty, selling the only thing they had left to sell. There but for the grace of God, Martha thought, though she wasn't sure she believed in God anymore. If there was a God, he had turned his face from Whitechapel long ago. Mr. Abramson's shop was squeezed between a butcher and a pawnbroker. The window displayed cheap, ready-made clothing, garments sewn by women like Martha in rooms like hers. All across the East End, a bell jangled as she entered, and the smell of new fabric briefly overpowered the street stench. Mr. Abramson emerged from the back room, a small man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He was neither kind nor cruel, merely indifferent, which in Whitechapel counted as fairness. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his Yiddish accent still strong despite 20 years in England. "You have work for me?" She unwrapped the shirts, laying them on the counter. He examined each one with his magnifying glass, checking the seams, testing the buttons. The seconds stretched into minutes. Martha's heart beat faster. If he rejected the work, she would have nothing. No money for rent, no money for food. She would be on the street within a week. "Adequate," he said finally, which from him was high praise. "Not your best work. The stitching on this one is uneven." He pointed to the third shirt. "But adequate." "I will pay you 3p for this one, 4p for the other two." "That's not fair," Martha protested, though she knew it was useless. The contract was 4p each. The contract was for good work. "This is merely adequate." His eyes were flat, final. "Take it or leave it." She took it. 11p. A shilling would have bought her bread, cheese, a bit of bacon. 11p meant just bread, or maybe bread and a handful of coal. She would have to choose. "I have more work," Mr. Abramson continued. "Trousers this time?" "More difficult." "I'll pay 6p per pair, but I'll want them by Friday. That's 3 days." "Can you manage 6 pairs?" Martha calculated quickly. Trousers took longer than shirts, perhaps 4 hours each. 6 pairs meant 24 hours of work over 3 days. It was brutal, but the payment would be 3 shillings, enough for rent and food, maybe even enough to buy a candle or two for her lamp. "I can manage," she said. He disappeared into the back room and returned with a bundle of dark wool. "Good quality," he said. "Don't waste it." "And Mrs. Whitmore?" He leaned forward slightly. "I hear the police have been asking questions in the neighborhood." "About the women who were killed." "You be careful." Martha had been trying not to think about the murders. Everyone in Whitechapel knew about them. 5 women, all prostitutes, all killed in the most horrible ways imaginable. The newspapers had given the murderer a name, Jack the Ripper. The last killing had been just weeks ago, Mary Kelly, butchered in her own room. The entire East End lived in fear now, wondering who would be next. "I'm not a prostitute," Martha said quietly. "But you're a woman, and you're poor, and you live in the streets where he hunts." Mr. Abramson's face was grave. "These days, that's enough. Be careful." She left the shop with her bundle of wool and her 11p, feeling the weight of both. The rain had intensified, cold drops that soaked through her shawl and dress within minutes. By the time she reached her building, she was shivering. Annie was waiting in the hallway. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank God. Lily's worse. The fever won't break." "I need to fetch the doctor, but I don't have the money." "Could you—" She trailed off, her eyes desperate. A doctor cost at least 2 shillings, sometimes more. Martha looked at the 11p in her hand, felt the weight of it. This was her food, her warmth, her survival. But she thought of the girl upstairs, burning with fever, perhaps dying while they stood here talking. "I don't have 2 shillings, she said, "but take what I have. It might convince the doctor to come, or at least to tell you what medicine she needs." She pressed the coins into Annie's hand before she could change her mind, before rational thought could stop her. Annie wept and thanked her. and Martha climbed the stairs to her room, empty-handed, hungry, cold, and knowing she'd just signed her own death warrant, in a way. Without money for food, she would weaken. Without strength, she couldn't work. Without work, she would starve or end up on the streets, selling herself like those women the Ripper hunted. But as she entered her room and saw the bundle of wool waiting to be cut and sewn, she found she couldn't regret her choice. In Whitechapel, where poverty stripped away everything human, where people became animals fighting for scraps, holding on to kindness was an act of rebellion. It was saying that despite everything, she was still Martha, still human, still capable of caring about something beyond her own survival. She sat at her table, picked up her scissors, and began to cut the first pattern for the trousers. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. She had been hungry before. She would be hungry again. The work before her was all that mattered. The work and the small, defiant hope that maybe, somehow, things could get better. Outside her window, Whitechapel continued its daily dance of misery. But in her attic room, Martha Whitmore bent over her sewing, her needle flashing in the weak light, creating something from nothing, making order from chaos, one stitch at a time. The day passed in a blur of cutting and pinning. Martha's hunger grew from a dull ache to a sharp pain, but she pushed through it, focusing on the work. By evening she had completed one pair of trousers, the seams straight and strong. It was good work, work that even Mr. Abramson couldn't fault. She folded it carefully and set it aside. A knock came at her door as darkness fell. She opened it to find Annie, tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of relief. "She's better," Annie said. "The doctor came, he gave her medicine, said it was quinsy infection in her throat. He said she'll recover." She grabbed Martha's hands. "You saved her life." "That money, it paid for the medicine." "You saved my daughter's life." Martha felt something warm spread through her chest, a feeling she'd almost forgotten. Joy, pure and simple. One child would live to see tomorrow. In Whitechapel, where death was so common, where children died every day from disease and hunger and neglect, one child would live. It wasn't much, but it was everything. "I'm glad," she said simply. That night, Martha worked by moonlight to save the gas, her stomach cramping with hunger. She had no money, no food, and 3 more days until she could deliver the trousers and get paid. She would have to find a way to survive until then. Perhaps she could sell something. She looked around her room at her meager possessions: a thin blanket, a chipped wash basin, a wooden crate that served as a table, her sewing supplies. There was nothing she could spare, nothing she could sell. She was contemplating going to the church for charity, swallowing her pride for a bowl of soup, when another knock came. This time it was Annie again, but she carried a small bowl covered with a cloth. "It's not much," Annie said. "Just some bread and a bit of broth." "But I couldn't, after what you did." She pushed the bowl into Martha's hands. "Please." The bread was stale and the broth was thin, mostly water with a few vegetables, but to Martha it tasted like the finest meal. She ate slowly, making it last, feeling strength return to her body. She wanted to weep at Annie's kindness, at this small miracle. That night, fed and warmed by the knowledge that she'd done good, Martha slept for a few hours. Her dreams were troubled, full of shadows and blood, but when she woke before dawn, she felt renewed. She lit her lamp and returned to the trousers. The next 2 days followed the same pattern: work, hunger, exhaustion, and small kindnesses that appeared when she needed them most. Annie brought her bits of food. Mrs. Levinsky from downstairs, hearing of what Martha had done, slipped her a penny for gas. Even the child Lily, still weak from her illness, climbed the stairs to bring Martha a cup of tea, the leaves probably used 3 times already, but still warm and comforting. Martha learned something during those days. She had thought poverty meant being alone, that in the struggle to survive there was no room for community, but she'd been wrong. The poorest people, those who had nothing, understood the value of everything. A penny, a crust of bread, a cup of tea. These small gifts were treasures, and they were given freely without expectation of return. By Friday morning, she had completed all 6 pairs of trousers. They were her best work, each stitch perfect, each seam strong. She wrapped them carefully and made her way to Mr. Abramson's shop, her feet light despite her exhaustion. He examined the trousers with his usual thoroughness, his magnifying glass catching the morning light. Martha held her breath. Finally, he looked up, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. "Excellent work, Mrs. Whitmore. Very excellent. 3 shillings, as promised." Counted out the coins. "I have more work for you, if you want it. A special order, a lady's dress. Fine fabric, difficult work, but I'll pay well. 10 shillings if you can have it ready in a week. 10 shillings. It was more money than Martha had seen in months. With 10 shillings she could pay rent for a month, buy food, even get new needles for her sewing. But a lady's dress was complicated work, requiring skill and attention she'd never had to use for simple shirts and trousers. "I'll take it," she said. Mr. Abramson smiled just a little. "I thought you would. Come back this afternoon. I'll have the fabric and pattern ready." Martha left the shop with 3 shillings in her pocket and hope in her heart. She stopped at the baker's and bought a whole loaf of bread still warm from the oven. At the greengrocer's she bought potatoes and a small piece of bacon. At the coal merchant's she bought enough coal to keep warm for a week. On her way home, she passed a group of women standing outside a pub. They were rough-looking, their clothes tattered, their faces hard. As she walked by, one of them stepped into her path. "Got any money to spare, love?" the woman asked. She was young, perhaps 20, but her eyes were ancient with suffering. Martha thought of her 3 shillings, of how hard she'd worked for them, of how much she needed them. Then she thought of what Annie had done, what Mrs. Levinsky had done, what even sick little Lily had done. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 6pence. "It's not much," she said, pressing it into the woman's hand. The woman stared at the coins, then at Martha. "You sure? You don't look like you can afford to give money away." "I can't," Martha admitted. "But neither can you afford to be without it. Buy yourself some food. Get off the streets for one night." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." "Because someone did it for me," Martha said simply. "Because we're all we have, us poor folk. We have to look after each other, or nobody will." She continued home, her load lighter in more ways than one. When she reached her building, she found Annie in the hallway, and she gave her 1 shilling. "For the medicine," she said. "For helping me," Annie protested, but Martha was firm. "Take it. Use it for Lily. Buy her something nourishing. Help her get strong again. In her room." Martha cooked a proper meal for the first time in weeks. Bacon fried in a pan, potatoes boiled soft, bread to soak up the grease. She ate until she was full, truly full, and it was glorious. Then she sat by her window and looked out at Whitechapel. The streets were the same, filthy, dangerous, desperate, but something had changed in how Martha saw them. She'd spent so long focused on her own suffering that she'd forgotten others were suffering too. She'd thought survival meant isolation, but she'd learned it meant the opposite. In helping Annie, in giving away her 11 pence when she needed it herself, in sharing her 6 shillings with a stranger, she'd found something more valuable than money. She'd found purpose. That afternoon, she returned to Mr. Abramson's shop and collected the fabric for the lady's dress. It was beautiful material, deep blue silk that shimmered in the light, delicate lace for trim, buttons of real pearl. Martha had never worked with anything so fine. The pattern was complex, with a fitted bodice and full skirts that would require precise measurements and careful stitching. "The lady is particular," Mr. Abramson warned. "She wants the dress for a ball next Friday. If the work is good, she may order more. This could be regular work for you, Mrs. Whitmore. Good work, good pay." Martha carried the fabric home like it was made of gold. That evening, she spread it out on her table and studied the pattern. This was more than just sewing, this was artistry. She would have to remember skills she'd learned as a girl before she'd married Thomas, when she'd apprenticed briefly with a dressmaker. Those had been good days, days when she'd dreamed of having her own shop someday, of creating beautiful things. Life had taken those dreams away. But maybe, just maybe, they could come back. She began to work, cutting the fabric with exquisite care. Each piece had to be perfect. There was no room for error with silk this expensive. As she cut and pinned, she thought about the woman who would wear this dress. Someone wealthy, obviously. Someone who would attend balls and parties, whose biggest worry was probably which jewels to wear. Martha felt no envy, though. Instead, she felt a kind of pride. Her hands, these poor hands, scarred with needle pricks and rough from poverty, would create something beautiful. Some wealthy woman would wear her work and never know the seamstress's name, but Martha would know. She would know that in her attic room in Whitechapel, surrounded by poverty and darkness, she had made something fine. Over the next week, Martha worked on the dress with a focus and passion she hadn't felt in years. She rose early and worked late, her fingers flying over the silk, creating tiny, perfect stitches that would hold the fabric together. The bodice took shape first, fitted and elegant, then the skirts full and flowing. The lace trim had to be attached with invisible stitches, and the pearl buttons had to be sewn on with precision. During this time, something began to change in Martha's building. Word spread about what she'd done, how she'd given her last money to help Annie's daughter, how she'd helped finish Annie's work, how she'd given coins to a stranger. In Whitechapel, where hardness and suspicion were survival tools, kindness was so rare it became legendary. Women began to come to her door. Mrs. Levinsky brought her a bit of thread she'd found at the market. Mary O'Brien from the third floor brought her a needle that had belonged to her mother. Even Sarah Mitchell, a woman Martha barely knew, came with a cup of real tea, not the reused leaves, but actual fresh tea. "Heard what you did for Annie's girl," Sarah said gruffly. "Thought you could use this." Martha realized she was becoming part of something she'd thought didn't exist in Whitechapel, a community. These women, all struggling, all barely surviving, were looking after each other, and she was at the center of it not because she'd asked to be, but because she'd made a choice to help when she herself had nothing. One evening, as she worked on the final details of the dress, Annie came to her room with a proposition. "I've been thinking," Annie said. "You're good at sewing, better than most, and you're kind. People trust you. What if we started something? A cooperative, like? We could pool our work, help each other meet deadlines, share the payments. Together we could take on bigger jobs, negotiate better rates with the middlemen." Martha paused in her stitching. "A cooperative? I know it sounds mad," Annie rushed on. "But think about it. Alone, we're nothing. The middlemen can pay us whatever they want because we have no choice. But together, 10 seamstresses, 20? We'd have power. We could demand fair wages. We could support each other when times are hard." It did sound mad, but it also sounded wonderful. Martha thought about the dress she was making, how one woman alone couldn't have managed such a commission in just a week. But with help, with a community. "Let me finish this dress," Martha said. "If Mr. Abramson pays me as promised, if the lady is satisfied, then we'll talk. We'll see if others want to join us." Annie's face lit up. "You'll really consider it?" "I'll more than consider it. I'll help you organize it." After Annie left, Martha returned to her sewing with renewed energy. This dress wasn't just a job anymore. It was a doorway to something bigger. If she could prove her skill with this commission, if she could show that quality work deserved quality pay, maybe they really could build something together. The dress was completed on Thursday night, one day before deadline. Martha held it up in the lamplight, and even in the dim attic room, it was breathtaking. The blue silk caught the light and seemed to glow. The stitching was invisible, the fit perfect, the lace trim delicate as frost. This was work worthy of any fine shop in the West End, work that would cost pounds, not shillings, and she had made it here in Whitechapel. In a room that stank of mould and poverty, Friday morning, Martha wrapped the dress in clean cloth and carried it to Mr. Abramson's shop like it was a holy relic. Her heart pounded as she unwrapped it for his inspection. This was everything, her future, her hope, the possibility of something better. Mr. Abramson examined the dress in silence, his magnifying glass catching every detail. Minutes passed. Martha's hands were shaking. Finally, he looked up, and his face showed something Martha had never seen there before, genuine admiration. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "this is exceptional work. Exceptional. The lady will be very pleased." He counted out 10 shillings, then paused and added another shilling. "For the quality. You've earned it." 11 shillings. Martha stared at the coins in her hand, hardly believing they were real. This was more money than she usually made in a month. "The lady has already requested another dress," Mr. Abramson continued, "and she has friends. I expect you'll have more commission soon." "But Mrs. Whitmore," he leaned forward, "don't let success make you foolish. Save your money." "These times, they don't last," Martha nodded, but inside her mind was racing. If she could get regular commissions like this, if she could teach other women her skills, if they could form a cooperative like Annie suggested, possibilities unfolded before her, each more exciting than the last. She walked home in a daze, the coins heavy in her pocket. She passed the usual scenes of Whitechapel misery, the drunks, the beggars, the hollow-eyed women. But today she saw something else too. She saw women helping each other, saw Mrs. Levinsky sharing her bread with a neighbor, saw a group of children playing in the street despite their ragged clothes, their laughter bright against the grey. Whitechapel was hell, but people survived it by holding on to each other. That evening, Martha invited Annie, Mrs. Levinsky, Mary O'Brien, and Sarah Mitchell to her room. She bought tea and biscuits with some of her earnings, real tea, real biscuits, a luxury none of them had enjoyed in months. "I've been thinking about Annie's idea," Martha began when they were all gathered. "A seamstress cooperative. At first, I thought it was impossible. But maybe it's not. Maybe it's exactly what we need." She laid out her plan. They would form a group, pool their skills and resources. When one woman got more work than she could handle, others would help. They would share tools, share knowledge, share the burden of survival. Most importantly, they would negotiate as a group with the middlemen, no more accepting whatever pittance was offered. They would demand fair payment, and if one middleman refused, they'd find another. "It won't be easy," Martha warned. "The middlemen will resist. They profit from our desperation. But if we stand together, they'll have to listen. How many would we need?" Mary asked. "As many as we can get. 10, 20, 50. "The more voices we have, the stronger we are." Sarah, the most skeptical of the group, spoke up. "And what happens when times are hard? When there's not enough work to go around? Won't we just fight among ourselves? That's when the cooperative matters most," Martha said. "When times are hard, we share what little there is. No one starves alone. No one ends up on the streets alone. We survive together, or we don't survive at all." She thought about the 11 pence she'd given to Annie, about the 6 pence she'd given to the stranger. Those small acts of kindness had come back to her tenfold. Not immediately, not directly, but they had. Because kindness created kindness, help created help. In Whitechapel, where everything was designed to tear people apart, they would choose to come together. "I'm in," Annie said immediately. "I've seen what Martha's willing to do for others. If she says we can make this work, I believe her." One by one, the others agreed. Mrs. Levinsky, Mary, even skeptical Sarah, they would try. They would build something new in the heart of darkness. "We'll need a name," Mary said. "Something that means something." They debated various names, but it was little Lily, still weak from her illness, who suggested the one they chose. She had come to her mother's side and listened to the adults talking, and when they asked for her opinion, she said simply, "Call it Hope." Because that's what it is, isn't it? Hope. The Whitechapel seamstress, Hope Cooperative, was born that night in Martha's attic room. 5 women, all poor, all struggling, all determined to create something better. They had no money, no equipment beyond their needles and thread, no guarantee of success. But they had each other, and in Whitechapel, that was everything. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Within a week, 10 more women had joined. Within 2 weeks, there were 25. They met in Martha's room, which was too small, so they moved to the basement of a church that let them use the space for free. They brought their sewing, their stories, their hopes and fears. Martha found herself becoming a leader, though she'd never asked for the role. She organized the work distribution, negotiated with the middlemen, taught the younger women advanced techniques. She discovered she had a talent for bringing people together, for seeing the best in everyone, for believing in possibilities that others thought impossible. The middlemen resisted at first, as she'd known they would. Mr. Abramson was sympathetic, but warned her that other middlemen were angry about the cooperative. They liked the system as it was, where desperate women competed against each other, driving wages down. "Be careful, Mrs. Whitmore," he told her. "Some of these men, they play rough. They don't like being told what to do by women." But Martha wasn't afraid. Or rather, she was terrified, but she did it anyway. She stood in front of Mr. Goldstein, the most powerful middleman in Whitechapel, and told him that the women of Hope wouldn't work for less than 6 pence per shirt. 8 pence per pair of trousers, he laughed at her. "You have no power here." "I'll take my business elsewhere." "Where?" Martha asked calmly. "We're organizing everywhere. Within a month, every seamstress in Whitechapel will be part of Hope. You'll have no one to exploit." It was a bluff, but it worked. Goldstein narrowed his eyes, reassessed her, and finally nodded. 6 pence per shirt. "But the work better be perfect." "It will be," Martha promised. That small victory led to others. Word of hope spread beyond Whitechapel into Bethnal Green, Spitalfields, Mile End. Women who had been isolated, working alone in their rooms, suddenly had a community. They had support, knowledge, and most importantly, they had each other. The cooperative grew to 50 women by winter. They met twice a week in the church basement, sharing work and skills. The older women taught the younger ones advanced techniques, how to create invisible seams, how to work with delicate fabrics, how to fit a garment so it looked tailored. The younger women, in turn, helped the older ones who were losing their eyesight or whose hands had become too stiff with arthritis. Martha organized a lending system. When someone was sick or injured and couldn't work, the others would contribute a penny or two to help cover rent and food. It wasn't charity. Everyone understood they might need help someday. It was insurance, a safety net woven from threads of community. But success brought new challenges. As hope grew stronger, the opposition grew fiercer. Some middlemen refused to work with cooperative members, trying to starve them into submission. Others spread rumors that Hope's work was inferior, that the women were troublemakers and radicals. One cold December night, Martha returned to her room to find it ransacked. Her sewing supplies were scattered, her fabric slashed, her few possessions destroyed. On the wall, someone had written in charcoal, "Mind your place." She stood in the ruins of her room and felt anger rise up, hot and fierce. This was meant to frighten her, to make her give up, but all it did was strengthen her resolve. They were afraid of hope, afraid of what organized women could do. That meant hope was working. She cleaned up the mess, salvaged what she could, and the next day told the cooperative what had happened. The women were outraged, frightened, but determined. If anything, the attack had unified them further. "We can't back down now," Annie said. "If we do, they'll know they can control us through fear." "We need to be smart," Martha replied. "We need to protect each other. No one works alone anymore. We travel in groups, especially at night. We watch out for each other." They implemented a buddy system. Women would walk each other home after meetings, would check on each other daily. When threats came, and they did come, written notes, verbal warnings, veiled intimidation, the women of Hope stood together. The winter was brutal. Coal was expensive, food scarce, and work sometimes slow, but the cooperative endured. When one woman couldn't afford coal, others shared theirs. When food was short, they pooled what they had and made sure everyone ate something. They survived not because life got easier, but because they faced it together. Martha's reputation grew. She became known not just in Whitechapel but throughout the East End as someone who fought for workers' rights, who believed in fair wages and dignity for the poor. Other trades began to take notice. Washerwomen, matchstick makers, factory workers, they all began to organize, inspired by Hope's example. On Christmas Eve, the cooperative gathered in the church basement for a celebration. It wasn't much, some bread, a bit of cheese, weak tea, but it felt like a feast. The women sang carols, their voices rising in the cold air. They shared stories, laughed, cried, remembered those they'd lost and celebrated those who remained. Martha looked around at the faces gathered there, Annie with Lily, both healthy now. Mrs. Levinsky, her hands too stiff to sew much but still contributing by teaching. Mary O'Brien, who'd just secured a major commission that would support her family for months. Sarah Mitchell, no longer skeptical, but one of Hope's fiercest advocates. 50 women, maybe more, all here because they'd chosen connection over isolation, hope over despair. "I want to say something," Martha said, and the room quieted. "A year ago I was alone. I was surviving, but barely. I thought that was all life could be, survival, nothing more. But you've all taught me something. You've taught me that even in the darkest places we can create light. Even in the poorest circumstances we can be rich in what matters. We have each other, and that's everything." The women applauded, some wiping away tears. Then Annie stood. "Martha Whitmore saved my daughter's life," she said. "She gave away her last money when she needed it herself. That act of kindness started all of this. So I want to propose something. Every Christmas Eve we gather like this, and we remember why we're here. Not just to earn wages or negotiate with middlemen, but to take care of each other. To be a family, even if we're not blood." The motion was approved unanimously. Christmas Eve would be their annual celebration, a time to remember how far they'd come and recommit to their principles. The new year brought unexpected opportunities. One of the ladies who'd commissioned a dress through Mr. Abramson was so impressed with the work that she began recommending Hope directly to her friends. Wealthy women from the West End started placing orders, paying premium prices for quality work. Martha saw the potential immediately. If they could build a reputation for exceptional craftsmanship, they could bypass the middlemen entirely. They could set their own prices, control their own destiny. She proposed they rent a small shop. Nothing fancy, just a place where clients could come to order custom garments. The women were hesitant. A shop meant rent, overhead, risk. But Martha argued that it also meant control, respect, legitimacy. "We're not just seamstresses working in attics anymore," she said. "We're craftswomen artists. We deserve to be treated as such." They pooled their savings and rented a small shop in Commercial Street. It was barely more than a closet, with room for only a small table and chair, but it had a window facing the street and a sign that read, "Hope Cooperative, Fine Dressmaking and Alterations." The shop opened in February 1889. The first week, they had no customers. The second week, a few curious people stopped by but didn't order anything. Martha began to worry they'd made a terrible mistake, that the rent would eat through their savings and leave them worse off than before. Then, in the third week, a carriage stopped outside. A well-dressed woman emerged and entered the shop. She was in her 40s, elegantly dressed, with the bearing of someone used to wealth and respect. "I'm looking for Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "I was told she does exceptional work." Martha stepped forward, suddenly conscious of her worn dress and rough hands. "I'm Martha Whitmore." The woman extended her hand. "I'm Mrs. Elizabeth Farnsworth. I need a new wardrobe, 6 dresses, various styles. I've been to the finest dressmakers in London, but none of them understand what I want." "I heard you're different." "That you listen." Martha took her measurements, discussed fabrics and styles, showed samples of their work. Mrs. Farnsworth was impressed, particularly by the blue silk dress that still hung in the shop as an example of their craftsmanship. "How much for 6 dresses?" Mrs. Farnsworth asked. Martha calculated quickly. Materials, labor, overhead. She could quote £5 and make a good profit. Or she could be bold. £12, she said, her heart hammering. It was more than she'd ever charged, more than seemed reasonable. Mrs. Farnsworth didn't even blink. That's quite reasonable. Most dressmakers would charge 20. "When can you start?" £12. Martha struggled to keep her face calm. That was enough to pay rent for months, to buy new equipment, to support the cooperative through any difficulties. "We can start immediately," she said. Mrs. Farnsworth became Hope's first major client, but she wasn't the last. She told her friends who told their friends, and soon the little shop was receiving regular commissions. Wealthy women were willing to pay for quality work, and they appreciated that Hope treated them as individuals, creating custom pieces that reflected their personalities rather than just copying the latest fashions. The cooperative expanded again. They needed more skilled seamstresses to handle the increased work, so Martha began training women who showed promise. She taught them not just how to sew, but how to interact with clients, how to understand what someone wanted even when they couldn't articulate it, how to create garments that made people feel beautiful. Some of the women proved exceptionally talented. Young Rose McCarthy had an eye for color and design that was almost supernatural. She could look at a client and immediately know what shades would complement them best. Older Catherine Walsh was a genius with alterations, able to take an ill-fitting garment and transform it into something that looked custom-made. Martha gave these women more responsibility, encouraging them to develop their skills. Hope wasn't just a cooperative anymore. It was becoming a training ground, a place where poor women could learn valuable trades and earn respect. By spring, they'd outgrown the tiny shop. They rented a larger space with room for multiple seamstresses to work simultaneously. They bought proper workbenches, good lighting, quality tools. The investment was significant, but the returns justified it. The cooperative was making enough money that Martha could finally afford to move from her attic room. She found a small flat in a better part of Bethnal Green, one room still but clean, with windows that let in real light, with floors that didn't tilt and walls that didn't leak. It felt like a palace, but even as things improved, Martha never forgot where she'd come from. She returned to Whitechapel regularly, visiting the women who still lived there, making sure no one was forgotten in Hope's success. She remembered the hunger, the cold, the desperation, and she was determined that no member of the cooperative would ever face those things alone. One evening, she was walking back from a client meeting when she saw a young woman standing in a doorway, shivering in the cold. She was thin, desperate-looking, with the hollow eyes Martha remembered from her own worst days. "Are you all right?" Martha asked. The woman looked at her warily. "What's it to you?" "I'm Martha Whitmore. I run a dressmaking cooperative. We're always looking for workers, if you know how to sew." "I can sew," the woman said.
"Used to work for a tailor before he
wanted payment I couldn't give." Her meaning was clear: sexual favors in exchange for work. Martha's anger flared, but she kept her voice calm.
"Come with me.
"We'll get you something to eat, and we can talk about work." Real work with real wages. The woman, her name was Eleanor, became the 97th member of Hope. Her story was sadly common. Many women ended up on the streets not because they wanted to, but because every legitimate option had been closed to them. Employers who demanded sexual favors, landlords who raised rents they couldn't afford, families who disowned them for being pregnant, or refusing marriages they didn't want. Hope became a refugee for these women. Martha made it a policy that they wouldn't ask about someone's past. All that mattered was their present and future. If they wanted to work, wanted to be part of the community, they were welcome. This approach wasn't popular with everyone. Some of the original members worried about their reputation, about being associated with women who'd been prostitutes or criminals. But Martha was firm. "We're all one bad month away from where they are," she said at a meeting. "Life's circumstances pushed them there, not personal failing. If we judge them, we're no better than the wealthy people who judge us." The debate was heated, but ultimately Martha's view prevailed. Hope would be open to anyone willing to work and be part of the community. This decision strengthened the cooperative in unexpected ways. Some of the new members brought skills from their previous lives, knowledge of how wealthy clients thought, understanding of fashion trends, connections to people who might become customers. By summer, Hope employed over 100 women and had contracts with several of the West End's finest shops. They were making quality garments that competed with anyone's, and their reputation for fair dealing and excellent craftsmanship was spreading. But success brought visibility, and visibility brought trouble. One August morning, Martha arrived at the shop to find a man waiting outside. He was well dressed, with the cold eyes of someone used to getting what he wanted. Behind him stood two larger men, clearly enforcers of some kind. "Mrs. Whitmore," the man said, "my name is Mr. Blackwood. I represent several businessmen who are concerned about your enterprise." "Concerned how?" Martha asked, though she already knew. She'd been expecting something like this. "Your cooperative is disrupting the natural order of things. You're encouraging women to demand higher wages to organize against their betters. This is causing problems for legitimate businesses." His smile was thin, cold. "We'd like to make you an offer. Dissolve the cooperative and we'll pay you £200. You can live comfortably and everyone goes back to how things should be." £200. It was more money than Martha had ever imagined having. She could live on that for years, could escape poverty forever. All she had to do was betray everything Hope stood for, abandon the 100 women who depended on the cooperative. "No," she said simply. Blackwood's expression hardened. "Ms. Whitmore, you misunderstand.
This isn't a negotiation.
We're being generous by offering to pay you at all. Dissolve the cooperative or we'll do it for you." "You can't," Martha said, though her heart was racing. "We've broken no laws. We're a legitimate business." "Laws," Blackwood laughed. "My dear woman, laws are for people with power. You have none. Your shop could burn down. Your members could be hurt. Accidents happen so easily in Whitechapel." He leaned closer. "Take the money, walk away. It's the smart choice." Martha thought about the women inside, about Annie and Lily, about Mrs. Levinsky and Rose and Catherine and Eleanor. She thought about every woman who'd found hope when they had none, who'd discovered they were worth more than they'd been told. "Get out," she said quietly. "And don't come back." Blackwood's face went cold. "You'll regret this, Mrs. Whitmore. I promise you that." He left with his enforcers, and Martha stood shaking in the doorway. She'd just made enemies of powerful men, men who could destroy everything she'd built, but she couldn't have done anything else. To accept their offer would be to admit that money mattered more than people, that power mattered more than justice. She called an emergency meeting of the cooperative. The women needed to know what they were facing. "We're in danger," she told them bluntly. "Powerful men want to destroy hope because we threaten their profits. They've threatened violence. We need to decide, together, whether to continue or whether the risk is too great." The room erupted in discussion. Some women were frightened and wanted to disband.
Others were angry and wanted to fight.
The debate raged for hours. Finally, Annie stood.
"I remember when I thought my daughter would die.
"I remember when I had no hope, no future, nothing but despair. Martha gave me hope. This cooperative gave me hope. If we let them destroy it, we're saying that the powerful get to decide who suffers and who doesn't. I say we fight." One by one, the women voted. It wasn't unanimous. Some chose to leave, and Martha understood their fear. But the vast majority voted to continue. They would face whatever came together. Martha implemented security measures. They hired a night watchman for the shop. Members traveled in groups. They documented everything, every threat, every incident, and made copies to give to sympathetic journalists and reformers. If something happened, the world would know who was responsible. The attack started small. Supplies would go missing. Clients would receive anonymous letters claiming Hope used inferior materials. Windows were broken in the night, but the women of Hope didn't break. Then came the fire. It was late September, past midnight.
Martha was asleep in her flat when someone pounded on her door.
She opened it to find Rose, soot-covered and weeping. "The shop," Rose gasped. "It's burning." They ran through the streets, Martha still in her nightgown. From blocks away, she could see the orange glow against the night sky. By the time they arrived, flames were consuming the building. Women from the cooperative were already there, trying to salvage what they could, but it was hopeless. The fire was too intense. Martha stood and watched everything burn. The workbenches, the fabric, the tools, the samples of their work, all of it consumed by flames. The fire brigade arrived, but too late to save anything. By dawn, only a blackened shell remained. The women gathered in the street as the sun rose, covered in soot and tears. Everything they'd built was gone. Martha felt despair crushing down on her. Maybe Blackwood had been right. Maybe they had no power. Maybe the fight was hopeless. Then Mrs. Levinsky spoke up, her voice strong despite her age. "So we rebuild." Martha looked at her. "With what?"
"We have nothing left. We have each other," Mrs. Levinsky said. "That's how we started, isn't it?"
"With nothing but each other. The fire took our building, our supplies." "It didn't take us," Annie nodded. "She's right. We've survived worse than this. We're East End women."
"Fire can't break us." One by one, the women agreed. They would rebuild.
They didn't know how yet, but they would find a way. The news of the fire spread quickly. To Martha's surprise, support came from unexpected places. Mrs. Farnsworth and her wealthy friends started a fund to help Hope rebuild, donating money and materials. Other cooperatives and labour organisations sent aid. Working-class people throughout London contributed what little they could. A penny here, a shilling there, all of it adding up. Even some shop owners in the East End, who'd initially resented Hope's success, came forward with offers of help. They'd realised that an attack on one business was an attack on all, that if men like Blackwood could destroy Hope with impunity, no one was safe. Within a month, they'd raised enough money to rent a new space, larger and safer than the first shop. The women worked day and night to set it up, and in November, 1 year after the cooperative had first formed, Hope reopened. The grand opening was attended by over 200 people. Workers, reformers, journalists, even some politicians who supported labour rights. Martha stood at the door and welcomed them all, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "A year ago," she said in her speech, "I was alone, starving, one step from the streets. Today, I stand with 100 sisters, and together we've built something that fire cannot destroy."
Because hope isn't a building.
It's not supplies or tools or money.
Hope is what we carry inside us, what we share with each other, and that can never burn. The applause was thunderous.
The new shop was blessed by both a rabbi and a priest, symbolizing the diverse community that Hope had become. And then they went back to work. The months that followed were challenging but rewarding. Hope continued to grow, expanding into new areas. They started teaching classes for young girls, training the next generation of seamstresses. They opened a small lending library in the shop where members could borrow books. They organized a savings club where women could put aside small amounts each week toward emergencies or goals. Martha was busier than ever, but happier than she'd been since Thomas died. She'd found a new family in Hope, a new purpose beyond mere survival. She was making a difference, not just in her own life, but in hundreds of lives. One winter evening, she was working late at the shop when there was a knock at the door. She opened it cautiously. They were still vigilant after the fire and found Mr. Blackwood standing there. Martha's hand went to the whistle she now carried, ready to summon help. But Blackwood raised his hands. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said. "I'm here to admit defeat." Martha studied him warily. "What do you mean?" "I mean you won," he said simply. "You and your women. We tried to destroy you and you came back stronger. We tried to intimidate you and you stood firm. My employers have decided to cut their losses. We won't bother you again. Why should I believe you? Because fighting you is bad business, Blackwood said with a bitter smile. Every time we attacked, you got more support, more publicity. You're folk heroes now.
Hurting you would only make things worse.
So my employers have decided to adapt.
If we can't beat you, we'll work around you. Martha understood what he wasn't saying.
The powerful men Blackwood represented were finding other ways to exploit workers, other businesses to squeeze. Hope had won this battle, but the war continued. Get out, she said, and don't come back. He left, and Martha locked the door behind him. She felt no triumph, only weariness. They'd survived, but how many others wouldn't? How many workers in how many industries were still being crushed by people like Blackwood? She realized then that Hope needed to be more than just a cooperative.
It needed to be a model, a proof that workers could organize, could demand better, could win.
Other industries needed to see what was possible. Over the next year, Martha travelled throughout London, speaking at labour meetings, helping other workers organise. She shared Hope's story, their successes and failures, what they'd learned. She became a voice for workers' rights, arguing for fair wages, safe conditions, dignity for all labourers. The movement grew. Washerwomen formed cooperatives, factory workers struck for better pay, dock workers organised for shorter hours. The East End, for so long a place of misery and exploitation, became a hotbed of labour activism. Martha's life took on a rhythm she'd never imagined. Days were spent managing Hope, which now employed over 200 women across 3 shops. Evenings were spent at meetings, planning strategy with other organisers. Nights were spent in her flat, reading about labour movements in other countries, learning from their successes and failures. She was exhausted, but alive in a way she'd never been before. This was what life was supposed to be, not just surviving, but striving, building, creating something larger than oneself. In the spring of 1891, Parliament began debating new labour laws. The debates were heated, with Conservatives arguing that workers were trying to destroy the economy and Progressives arguing for basic human rights. Martha was invited to testify before a committee to speak about her experiences. She stood in that grand room, surrounded by wealthy men in expensive suits, and told her story. She spoke about the hunger, the cold, the desperation of poverty. She spoke about the women of Hope, about their struggles and triumphs. She spoke about what happened when workers were treated as human beings deserving of dignity and fair compensation. "Gentlemen," she concluded, "you have a choice. You can continue to allow people like me to be exploited, to be worked to death for pennies, or you can acknowledge that every person who labours deserves to live, not just survive. The choice will define what kind of nation we are." The committee listened in silence. Some were moved, others clearly hostile. Martha didn't know if she'd made any difference, but she'd spoken her truth, and that had to be enough. The labour laws that eventually passed were weak, full of compromises and loopholes. But they were something. They established minimum standards, required some safety measures, gave workers basic protections. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Hope continued to thrive. By 1892, they employed over 300 women and had contracts with shops throughout London. They'd expanded beyond dressmaking into other garment work, and they'd started a vocational school to teach young women skills. Martha walked through the main shop one day and marvelled at how far they'd come. Women sat at proper workbenches in a well-lit, heated space. They chatted as they worked, their voices full of life and hope. No one was starving. No one was one step from the streets. They were working, yes, but on their own terms, for fair wages with dignity. She thought about that night in her attic,
room when she'd given her last 11 pence to help Annie's daughter.
That small act of kindness had started everything. It had shown her that even in the darkest places connection was possible, that helping others helped yourself, that together people were stronger than any force arrayed against them. Annie found her standing there. "Remembering?" she asked. "Always," Martha said. "I never want to forget what it was like, what we came from." "We won't," Annie promised. "That's why we gather every Christmas Eve. That's why we tell new members our stories. So we remember what we're fighting for." That evening, Martha visited her old attic room in Flower and Dean Street. A new woman lived there now, young and desperate, probably living the same nightmare Martha had lived. She knocked on the door. The woman who answered looked frightened. "I've paid my rent. I don't owe anyone." "I know," Martha said gently. "I used to live here. I just wanted to tell you something. You don't have to do this alone. There's a cooperative, Hope, on Commercial Street. We're always looking for seamstresses. If you know how to sew or want to learn, come by. We'll help you." She pressed a card into the woman's hand and left. She didn't know if the woman would come. Many didn't. Pride, fear, distrust kept them isolated. But some did, and those some became part of something larger. As Martha walked home through the darkening streets, she thought about hope itself. Hope wasn't naive optimism or blind faith. Hope was work. Hope was choosing to believe that things could be better and then doing the hard labor to make them better. Hope was getting knocked down and standing up again. Hope was looking at impossible odds and deciding to try anyway. She'd started with nothing, no money, no power, no prospects, just a needle, thread, and the willingness to help someone when she herself had nothing. From that tiny seed, this entire movement had grown. What else was possible? What other seeds were waiting to be planted? The years passed. Hope continued to grow and evolve. They opened more shops, started more programs, helped more women. Martha's hair turned grey, her hands grew gnarled with arthritis, but her spirit never dimmed. She was 60 years old when she finally stepped back from day-to-day management of Hope, handing control to younger women she'd trained. Rose McCarthy, the young woman who'd had such an eye for colour and design, became the new director. Under her leadership, Hope flourished even more, expanding into men's clothing, household textiles, and eventually even furniture upholstery. Martha spent her later years writing, documenting the history of Hope and the labour movement, trying to preserve lessons learned for future generations. She wrote about the mistakes they'd made, the victories they'd won, the ongoing struggles they faced. On Christmas Eve, 1905, Martha attended Hope's annual gathering. It had grown from 5 women in an attic room to over 1,000 members across dozens of cooperatives throughout London. The gathering was held in a large hall now, rented for the occasion. Martha was asked to speak, as she was every year. She stood before the crowd, looking at faces young and old, rich and poor, English and immigrant, all of them connected by the simple belief that people deserved dignity. 32 years ago, she began, I gave away my last 11 pence to help a neighbour's sick daughter. I was starving, desperate, one step from disaster. That choice should have destroyed me. Instead, it saved me, because it reminded me that
I was human, that I was capable of more than mere survival.
All of you gathered here, you're the result of that choice. You're the proof that kindness isn't weakness, that cooperation isn't naive, that hope isn't foolish. You're living evidence that even in the darkest places we can create light. The world hasn't changed enough. There's still poverty, still exploitation, still suffering, but it has changed some, and it changed because people like us refused to accept that things had to stay as they were. We chose to hope, and then we did the work to make that hope real. Keep doing that work. Keep fighting. Keep believing. Keep helping each other, because that's what changes the world. Not grand gestures or powerful leaders, but ordinary people making the extraordinary choice to care. The applause was overwhelming. Martha sat down, feeling tired but satisfied. She'd lived a good life, a meaningful life. She'd made a difference. A few months later, Martha Whitmore died peacefully in her sleep. She was 73 years old. Her funeral was attended by thousands. Women she'd helped, workers she'd inspired, reformers she'd influenced. They came from all over England, from all walks of life, united in their grief and gratitude. Hope continued after her death, growing and evolving with the times. During World War I, Hope factories produced uniforms for soldiers. During the Depression, Hope Cooperatives provided work when private businesses were failing. Through decades of change, Hope endured. The shops themselves eventually closed. Economics and technology made traditional cooperatives less viable. But the spirit of Hope continued. Women who'd been part of Hope went on to become union organizers, politicians, business owners, educators. They carried Martha's lessons with them, that people mattered more than profits, that cooperation was stronger than competition, that hope was something you created through action. By the late 20th century, few people remembered Martha Whitmore or the Whitechapel seamstress Hope Cooperative. They'd become footnotes in labor history, their story overshadowed by larger movements and more famous leaders. But in Whitechapel, in a small museum dedicated to the area's history, there's an exhibit about hope. It shows Martha's original sewing kit preserved carefully behind glass. It displays photographs of the early members, their faces showing both the hardness of poverty and the light of determination. It tells the story of how one woman's small act of kindness grew into a movement that changed thousands of lives. And every year, on Christmas Eve, a small group gathers at the site where Hope's first shop once stood. They're descendants of Hope members, labor historians, and people who simply believe in the cooperative's ideals. They light candles, share stories, and remember. They remember that poverty is not inevitable, that exploitation is not acceptable, that individuals working together can create change. They remember Martha Whitmore, the seamstress who chose hope when she had every reason to choose despair. Most importantly, they remember that the work isn't finished. There are still people struggling, still workers being exploited, still communities in need. The specific challenges have changed. Fewer people sew shirts in attic rooms now, but the fundamental issue remains. How do we create a world where everyone has dignity, where everyone has enough, where everyone has hope? The answer, Martha would say if she was still alive, is the same as it always was. Together. We face challenges together, support each other through difficulties, celebrate victories together. We choose connection over isolation, cooperation over competition, hope over despair. We pick up our needles, whatever form they take in our modern world, and we begin stitching. Stitch by stitch, thread by thread, we weave together a better world. The work is slow, often frustrating, sometimes dangerous. But it's work worth doing because, in the end, that's what Martha Whitmore's life teaches us. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That one person's choice can ripple outward, touching hundreds or thousands of lives. That hope isn't something you wait for. It's something you create, day by day, stitch by stitch, through the hard work of caring about each other. In her attic room in Whitechapel, sitting in the gaslight, a poor seamstress once chose to give away her last coins to help a neighbor. That choice echoed through time, changing lives, inspiring movements, proving that even in the darkest places, even in the most desperate circumstances, hope is possible. All it takes is one person willing to believe, willing to act, willing to help. All it takes is someone choosing to stitch together threads of kindness, compassion, and solidarity into something beautiful. All it takes is hope, and hope as Martha Whitmore knew, is never really lost. It's always there, waiting to be picked up, waiting to be shared, waiting to transform the world, one small act at a time. The Seamstress of Whitechapel died more than a century ago, but her legacy lives on in every cooperative, every union, every movement that says people matter more than profit. Her legacy lives on in everyone who chooses to help when they themselves have little, who chooses connection over isolation, who chooses hope over despair. The threads she wove still hold. The hope she created still endures, and somewhere, in some corner of our modern world, another Martha Whitmore is picking up her needle, choosing to believe that things can be better, starting to stitch together a new pattern of hope. The work continues, the hope endures always.